Wars do not always announce their turning points with explosions or headlines. Sometimes, history changes quietly, inside cramped offices, between half-decoded messages, carried by men who do not yet realize they are holding the future in their hands. On the morning of June 5, 1942, far from the smoke and fire of the Pacific, a small group of officers in Berlin began to sense that something had gone terribly wrong. What they were reading did not yet have a name. It did not yet have numbers. But it carried a weight that could not be ignored. This is the moment when the Axis first understood what Midway truly meant. June 5, 1942. 10:30 a.m. Berlin. Inside the intelligence section of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, a signals officer moves through his routine, sorting intercepted diplomatic and military transmissions, passing decoded fragments to the duty analyst. New cables continue to arrive from German naval attaches in Tokyo, their content filtered through layers of encryption and caution. At first glance, the reports seem incomplete. They mention heightened Japanese radio traffic near Midway, scattered hints of combat, and vague allusions to losses. No clear summary emerges. Yet something about the tone stands apart. The Tokyo messages feel strained, carefully worded, restrained, and unusually hesitant. Several transmissions make indirect reference to damaged Japanese carriers and ongoing efforts to recover survivors. For seasoned analysts, this alone raises alarms. Japanese communications rarely acknowledge setbacks, even indirectly. The fact that damage is mentioned at all suggests events far more serious than the cables are willing to admit. The analyst flags the reports for immediate circulation and drafts a preliminary brief for the operations division. As the morning stretches on, more fragments arrive. They reference emergency recovery operations. Missing air crews. Flight personnel whose names had only recently appeared on active service lists. By midday, a grim pattern begins to emerge for those comparing the reports line by line. The fighting around Midway has turned decisively against Japan. The First Air Fleet, long considered the spearhead of Japanese naval power, appears to have suffered losses unlike anything seen since the Pacific War began. Within Berlin's high command, the realization spreads quietly but unmistakably. Something fundamental is shifting thousands of miles away. General staff officers gather in small clusters, reviewing the fragments against known Japanese carrier deployments. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Iryu. All had been committed to the operation. Yet nowhere in the reports is there confirmation that these ships remain operational. The absence itself becomes the most troubling detail in the room. Though Germany and Japan are bound by alliance, the flow of information between them has always been limited. German planners have long relied on inference rather than transparency. Now, even without official confirmation, the scale of the disaster is becoming impossible to ignore. One officer recalls earlier assessments that projected Japanese naval air dominance lasting at least another year. Those estimates had shaped German hopes that Japan would tie down American naval power, easing pressure on Germany's western front. The Midway reports shatter those assumptions in a matter of hours. Axis strategy depends on momentum shared across continents. If Japan can no longer sustain offensive pressure in the Pacific, the United States will be free to concentrate its growing strength elsewhere. And Berlin understands exactly where that strength will be directed. Late in the afternoon, more detailed summaries arrive from Tokyo. They narrow the possibilities. For Japanese carriers are reported ablaze or sunk. Aircraft losses are extensive. A staff officer compiles a single-page brief that moves rapidly through the upper layers of command. Its language is cautious, but its meaning is unmistakable. Japan has suffered an operational defeat of historic proportions. In the offices of the Reich Chancellery and the Oberkommando der Marine, senior officers read the report in silence. They immediately grasp what the loss of Japan's carrier fleet means in practical terms. Without those ships, Japan cannot maintain offensive reach across the Pacific. Nor can it prevent the United States from rebuilding rapidly and on a massive scale. German planners have studied American industrial output closely. They know it will accelerate through 1942 and 1943. The destruction of Japan's elite carrier groups removes one of the last obstacles to that expansion. By evening, the German High Command accepts the reports as credible. The scale of the losses is no longer disputed. What remains uncertain is how Japan will respond, and whether it can recover at all. Those responsible for long-term planning understand that these questions will define the coming months. One thing, however, is already clear. A major shift is underway, and Germany must reassess its expectations of the Pacific War. In the days following the first confirmed reports, senior officers across the German command worked to assemble a coherent picture of what Midway means for the Axis. Admiral Karl Donitz studies the intelligence with particular focus. His concern lies in the Atlantic, where Germany's U-boat campaign depends heavily on American resources being stretched thin. For years, German naval planners had assumed Japan would keep the United States occupied in the Pacific, forcing American shipbuilding to split across two theaters. Now, with 4 carriers destroyed, Donitz re-examines the numbers. The conclusion is unavoidable. Pressure on the U-boat campaign will increase. Donitz meets with his operations staff. They review American shipbuilding projections and note the rapid expansion of destroyer and escort fleets. With fewer immediate threats in the Pacific, U.S. naval planners will have greater freedom of action. In Berlin, this assessment spreads quickly among naval analysts. The Atlantic will soon command more American attention, and Germany's margin of advantage will shrink. General Alfred Jodl approaches the intelligence from a broader strategic perspective. Earlier assumptions that Japan might seize Hawaii or establish dominance across the Central Pacific now appear unrealistic. Japan's posture will tighten. Its ability to coordinate any major joint operation with Germany will diminish. In internal memoranda, Jodl notes that Axis planners must revise expectations, particularly regarding the timing of American redeployments toward Europe. The belief that Japan could significantly delay the transfer of U.S. men and material is no longer sustainable. Within the planning rooms of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, analysts turn their attention to Japanese industrial capacity. The conclusion is stark. Replacing 4 fleet carriers cannot be done quickly, if at all. Japanese shipyards cannot match American scale or speed. Even with accelerated production, the balance will remain unfavorable. This reality shapes the next round of assessments. Japan will be forced into a defensive strategy. The United States will move steadily towards sustained offensive operations. Staff officers debate the impact on German grand strategy. Some point out the obvious limitation. Germany has little influence over Japan's decisions. Coordination has always been constrained by distance, secrecy, and diverging priorities. Yet through 1941 and early 1942, Berlin had counted on Japan to divert American focus. Midway exposes how fragile that expectation truly was. As new intelligence is absorbed, officers recognize a deeper problem. The Axis lacks the capacity to respond collectively to major setbacks. At the Reich Chancellery, attention turns to the political dimension. Japanese public statements downplay the losses while stressing resolve. German diplomats note the defensive tone, an effort to contain domestic and international reaction. To Berlin, this is further confirmation. Japan understands the severity of the defeat, but will not acknowledge it openly. The secrecy complicates German analysis and reinforces long-standing frustrations over limited transparency between allies. By the end of the week, the conclusion is unavoidable. Midway is not just a Japanese defeat. It is the moment the strategic balance of the war begins to tilt quietly, irreversibly, and far beyond the waters where the battle was fought. By late June, the German High Command quietly revises its internal forecasts. The conclusion is no longer debated. Japan's ability to slow American momentum has been sharply reduced, and that limitation will persist for the foreseeable future. Analysts warn that as U.S. industrial output accelerates, German operations in Europe will come under steadily increasing pressure. Midway is no longer viewed as a localized naval defeat. Within planning circles, it is understood as a strategic rupture, one that shatters the Axis expectation of coordinated pressure across two hemispheres. Among senior German leaders, an unspoken recognition settles in. Germany will soon face the full weight of American power without any meaningful distraction in the Pacific. The trajectory of the war is bending, and with each new assessment, the implications of Midway grow clearer. Preparations begin for a future in which Germany must absorb the Allied buildup largely on its own. In Tokyo, the German embassy receives its first detailed explanations from Japanese officials only after several days of restricted communication. Ambassador Eugen Ott and his staff collect the statements and compare them carefully against earlier attaché reports. The Japanese account describes Midway in restrained language, emphasizing isolated reverses rather than the destruction of 4 fleet carriers. Ott notes the deliberate phrasing immediately. Japan is attempting to preserve confidence, both internally and among its allies, while maintaining strict control over the narrative. German military attaches stationed in Tokyo observe the atmosphere more closely. Publicly, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy speak in measured tones, presenting Midway as a setback that can be overcome. Privately, their demeanor suggests deeper unease. Attaché notes record a consistent pattern: reluctance to provide specifics about aircraft losses, evasive answers regarding the condition of surviving fleet units. These omissions reveal the tension between the need to sustain morale and the reality of the damage sustained. Ott compiles these observations for Berlin, emphasizing that while Japanese officials insist their strategic position remains intact, they offer no clear explanation for how lost carriers will be replaced or how naval aviation will be reorganized. In private conversations, Japanese officers concede what public statements avoid. The loss of experienced pilots, deck crews, and command personnel carries consequences equal to the destruction of ships themselves. For both Germany and Japan, these human losses are irreplaceable in the short term. Embassy dispatches stress that Japan's naval aviation community cannot be rebuilt quickly, and that the effects of Midway will extend far beyond the immediate aftermath. Within the embassy, German attaches begin to notice subtle changes. Meetings take longer to arrange. Senior officials are less accessible. These delays are interpreted as signs of internal debate within Japan's command structure, an effort to stabilize planning while deciding how openly to confront the scale of the defeat. These observations form a critical component of the reports sent back to Berlin. There, analysts at the Foreign Office study Ott's cables alongside other intelligence streams. They identify discrepancies between Japan's public posture and its internal communications. The conclusion is clear. Japan is projecting resilience while quietly grappling with strategic vulnerability. German planners understand the instinct, but the lack of transparency complicates their ability to forecast American movements with precision. A separate report from the German naval attaché in Tokyo focuses on operational realities. Remaining Japanese carriers, he notes, are undergoing repairs or refits. New air groups must be assembled almost from scratch. He states bluntly that Japan will be incapable of launching major offensive operations in the Central Pacific for an extended period. This assessment aligns with earlier German conclusions but sharpens their urgency. In Berlin, officers recognize that Japan's defensive posture will leave American planners freer to concentrate resources elsewhere during the second half of 1942. Later dispatches from Tokyo attempt to reassure Germany. Japanese officials emphasize defensive preparations and increased aircraft production. Yet the embassy staff notes a change in tone. The confidence of early 1942 is gone. Ott interprets this as an implicit acknowledgement. Japan understands the magnitude of the challenge ahead, even if it is unwilling to articulate it fully to its allies. By midsummer, German diplomats and military attaches reach a shared conclusion. Midway has placed Japan under immense strain. Its leadership is now managing not only operational reconstruction, but also internal morale. For Germany, this reality demands a reassessment of any expectation of coordinated Axis strategy. The messages from Tokyo convey more than battlefield losses. They reveal the limits of what Japan can admit, and the limits of what it can recover. In Berlin, these conclusions settle quietly into the High Command's planning. Japan remains committed to the war, but its capacity to shape events in the Pacific has fundamentally changed. Germany must now prepare for a shifting balance that will influence every major decision ahead. As more reliable figures from Midway reach Berlin's planning divisions, the High Command enters a period of focused reassessment. Long-term forecasting officers revise their projections of Japanese naval strength, comparing pre-Midway assumptions with the post-battle reality. The verdict is swift. Rebuilding even a fraction of Japan's carrier force will take time the Axis no longer controls. Within the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, analysts examine the implications for the latter half of 1942. They study the American buildup already underway in the Atlantic and consider how Japan's weakened position will influence U.S. strategy. German intelligence has tracked American industrial output closely, especially shipbuilding rates. With Japan unable to fully engage the United States in the Pacific, a greater share of American naval power will inevitably shift toward Europe. This prospect weighs heavily on those responsible for defending the continent. Operational planners analyze likely convoy routes, air deployments and logistical corridors. Their conclusion is sobering. By early 1943, the Western Allies will reach a significantly higher operational tempo. Countering that growth will demand resources Germany can scarcely spare. General Alfred Jodl reviews these assessments personally. He convenes planning officers and requests updated estimates on Japanese shipbuilding capacity, pilot training pipelines, and fleet readiness. The figures confirm what many already suspect. Even if new carriers are completed, Japan cannot replace its lost air crews quickly. This constraint ensures that Japan's future operations will be cautious and defensive, not expansive. Jodl integrates this understanding into the broader strategic picture. An increasingly confident United States, a strained and defensive Japan, and a Germany confronting mounting challenges across multiple fronts. The balance of the war is no longer theoretical. It is shifting measurably, relentlessly, and Berlin can now see the direction it is moving. Meanwhile, the Oberkommando der Marine turns its attention to the Atlantic. The implications of Midway reach far beyond the Pacific, and Admiral Karl Donitz studies the revised assessments with growing concern. Intelligence forecasts now predict a steady expansion of American escort forces. With Japan no longer able to draw significant U.S. naval strength eastward, the United States will be free to reinforce convoy protection with increasing intensity. Donitz notes that losses among German U-boats in June already reflect this mounting pressure. Allied anti-submarine tactics are improving, and escort coverage is growing denser by the month. He reviews the Midway intelligence through this lens, recognizing that the shift in American priorities will reshape the operational environment of the Atlantic for the foreseeable future. The Foreign Office contributes its own analysis. German diplomats in Tokyo report that Japan is restructuring its naval command and accelerating defensive preparations across the Central and Southern Pacific. Berlin interprets this focus on defense as further confirmation that Japan's contribution to broader Axis objectives will diminish. Officials also anticipate new constraints in diplomatic cooperation, as Japanese authorities become increasingly selective in what information they share regarding future operations. This reduced transparency complicates German planning. Without reliable insight into Japanese intentions, Berlin finds it harder to anticipate shifts in the Pacific theater that might indirectly affect Europe. By late summer of 1942, the High Command's revised forecasts reflect a clear change in outlook. Analysts now operate under the assumption that Germany will confront an expanding Allied coalition with limited assistance from Japan. While Japan remains engaged in the war, its ability to shape global strategy has been sharply reduced. As projections extend into 1943, the sense of strategic isolation deepens. The tone of internal documents grows more restrained, more sober. Where earlier assessments carried cautious optimism, these now acknowledge a war increasingly tilting in the Allies' favor. The German High Command completes its analysis with quiet acceptance. Midway has accelerated trends already visible in industrial data and naval reports. Allied strength is rising rapidly, and the Axis lacks the capacity, both material and organizational, to match that growth. Japan's defeat forces Germany to confront the conflict with fewer illusions and a clearer understanding of the road ahead. As autumn approaches, Berlin receives its most detailed evaluations yet of Japan's post-Midway recovery. Naval attaché reports indicate that Japan has begun reorganizing its surviving air groups, but the losses among trained flight crews remain severe. German analysts emphasize that carrier aviation depends on experience accumulated over years. Ships can be rebuilt. Skill cannot. No accelerated program can quickly replace the expertise lost at Midway. The Intelligence Division compiles a comprehensive comparison of American and Japanese shipbuilding capacity. The disparity is stark and widening. American shipyards are producing carriers, escorts, and auxiliary vessels at a pace that exceeds all Axis projections. Japanese construction programs, constrained by resources and infrastructure, cannot compensate for the losses sustained. German officers reviewing these figures understand the implications immediately. The Pacific balance is shifting decisively. The United States will soon possess sufficient carrier strength to sustain operations across multiple theaters simultaneously, something Japan can no longer hope to counter. In senior staff meetings, officers openly acknowledge the long-term consequences. Earlier forecasts that assumed continued Japanese dominance through 1942 and into 1943 are now obsolete. Analysts agree that even with sustained effort, Japan will not regain the offensive capacity it once held. As these conclusions circulate, a somber atmosphere settles over the planners tasked with anticipating Allied movements in the coming year. German diplomats in Tokyo continue to provide detailed observations. Publicly, Japanese officials project confidence. Privately, they voice concern over material shortages and the slow pace of training new aircrews. Ambassador Eugene Ott notes that while the Imperial Japanese Navy maintains strict control over information, the tone of discussions has changed. Meetings that once focused on future operations now revolve around defensive priorities and resource management. These shifts reinforce Berlin's understanding of Japan's predicament. Inside the Reich Chancellery, officials responsible for propaganda review the intelligence but choose not to highlight Midway in public messaging. Instead, attention remains fixed on Europe and North Africa. The silence is deliberate. Acknowledging the scale of Japan's defeat would undermine confidence in the alliance and expose the limits of Axis coordination. Privately, however, German planners cannot ignore the reality. To them, Midway is not an isolated disaster. It is an early signal of a broader alignment of Allied strength, industrial, logistical, and strategic. By late 1942, these insights are fully incorporated into operational planning. Forecasts assume continued American expansion in manpower and production. With little resistance in the Central Pacific, the Allies gain greater freedom to choose where and when to apply their power. The German Navy prepares for intensified pressure in the Atlantic. The Army anticipates deeper Allied involvement in Europe. The assessments produced during this period reveal an increasing awareness of Axis limitations. Officers comparing intelligence from multiple fronts reflect on how swiftly circumstances have changed. Only months earlier, Germany expected Japan to keep sustained pressure on the United States. Midway overturned that expectation in a matter of days. Now, German planners recognize that the Axis alliance operates under constraints that determination alone cannot overcome. Japan will continue to fight, but it cannot restore the balance that once existed in the Pacific. In private discussions, senior officers articulate the deeper meaning of Midway. It is not merely the loss of ships or aircrews. It marks a structural shift in the war itself. Allied industrial and logistical advantages are beginning to converge across continents, while the Axis faces hard limits in coordination and capacity. By the end of 1942, the German High Command accepts what cannot be said publicly. The consequences of Midway will extend far into the future. Japan will not recover its former strength, and the United States will enter the coming year with growing resources and rising confidence. The strategic landscape has changed. And Germany must now fight a war increasingly defined by pressures its allies can no longer relieve.